Johannes Brahms on this program and one work by Sarasate. As it happens, the four works by Brahms neatly encapsulate his entire career, zeroing in on four works of chamber music, each for a different ensemble. And I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to do sort of a bird's eye view of Brahms's entire career as a composer of chamber music. There are a couple of common threads that run through this program, and one of them is a violinist and composer by the name of Joseph Joachim, and I will explain that as his name recurs.
We're having a bit of a problem here with moving the presentation, so go ahead.
We're going to go ahead with the discussion of the music. So what is an FAE sonata? That's the earliest work on the program. You'll see it's listed third on your program page. Sonatensatz, scherzo for violin and piano in C minor. This was sort of a collaborative effort among three composers, and I believe it was construed as a birthday gift for the violinist Joseph Joachim.
I'm so proud of myself. I do all kinds of engineering around here.
And Gary has forgotten more about the technology than I will ever know. At any rate, in the very early 1850s, it was about a year before Robert Schumann died, Johannes Brahms came from Hamburg to meet the Schumanns I believe they were in Leipzig at the time, and Schumann listened to Brahms play for about 10 minutes and said, "Please stay here, I want to get my wife." His wife, of course, was the brilliant pianist Clara Schumann, and his diary that night said, "Met Brahms today, a genius." So he recognized immediately. Well, they decided, Brahms and Schumann and another composer who was a student of Schumann's named Albert Dietrich, that each of them would write a movement, a composite sonata, as a birthday gift for Joseph Joachim.
And Joachim, of course, being the great violinist, and would become Brahms's very dear friend.
Can we switch forward one slide?
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Because Brahms had earlier collaborated and toured with a Hungarian violinist named Eduard Reményi. And Reményi was quite a colorful character. Reményi eventually arranged for Brahms to meet Joseph Joachim. So this is a very convoluted, closely woven circle of musicians and performers. But Brahms, in particular, developed a lifelong interest in the folk music of Hungary that eventually metamorphosed into the beloved Hungarian dances that were first for piano four hands and then for orchestra. But it's an important influence on more than one of the movements we're going to hear this afternoon. At any rate, this one movement scherzo is the only one of those three movements that were written by three different composers that has survived in the repertoire, and it represents the very earliest example that we have that did not get destroyed, because Brahms destroyed a lot of his own music, of Brahms's style. And what I hope you're going to notice through the many examples we're going to cover over the next 20 minutes or so is how the role of the piano changes in the way it's communicating with the string instrument. So let's listen to example one, and what I think you'll notice is that the piano is frenetic and it practically overwhelms the violin. Track one, please, John. So Gary, does the violinist have to fight for attention there?
I don't think so, actually. It's not a question of attention. You know, we should just go back that FAE stands in German for free but lonely, which you'd think as a birthday present is a kind of a weird thing to do. But I think Brahms's idea that because he wrote scherzos, which are not funny, they're supposed to be a joke, but they were actually very dramatic. And both instruments add to the drama. Now, obviously, this instrument can overwhelm, as you said, but this skill that Brahms displays in this very early work is a testament to Remery, because he was brought to Schumann as his accompanist. Now that's a term we don't even use anymore, right? But the accompanying of a violinist like Remery was such a big deal for Brahms that he learned about the instrument, and he was really capable of understanding as a pianist what was necessary, and he wrote very skillfully in this movement.
So this slide has nothing whatsoever to do with this afternoon's program, except it's a very interesting footnote to music history. Romaini continued touring on his own, and he dropped dead in San Francisco in the middle of a concert in 1898. So he earned his place in history. I think that happened to one conductor over the years.
At least.
Yes. All right, so we're moving on now to the next piece chronologically, which is the piano quintet that is the anchor work on the second half of this program. And this takes us to middle period Brahms. I believe we have some slides of Vienna.
We certainly do.
Vienna in the middle of the 19th century. The quintet went through a number of metamorphoses. It is another work that he struggled with. It went through a two-piano version, and eventually he decided on the combination of piano plus a full string quartet. It is one of the most splendid and enduring works in the piano quintet repertoire. The opening, which is our next example, is in unison, and then it is interrupted by a veritable explosion from the piano with string punctuation. May we hear track 2, please? I hear a much more homogeneous collaboration between strings and piano here.
It's really an orchestral writing, isn't it? And
yes.
it's an incredibly powerful thing, especially the way he spaces out the instruments, because you have balance and yet this incredible forward power in this work.
It's at least 10 years later into Brahms's career, and you will hear in his slow movement, which is our next example, that he has learned the necessity of relaxation after the tension and drama of that very powerful and dark first movement. My next example from the slow movement, it's warm, it's tender, it's got lushly romantic harmonies, and you'll hear a pulsation with gentle syncopations that just sort of hints at the fact that the tension hasn't disappeared, it's just been soothed for a while. May we hear the track 3, please? Those are so Brahmsian, those rich harmonic transitions.
And endless legato, too. As a string player, we're always faced with how do you maintain that endless line, because eventually you have to change the bow. Well, the physics of changing the bow means at some point it has to stop. And our job as a good string player is to make you believe that that stop never took place.
Brahms was, like Mendelssohn before him, but in a completely different way, master of the scherzo. And this scherzo, from significantly later in his career, about a decade, than the one we heard in the FAE violin piano movement, it's again tense and expectant. One thing that you will hear is a very Beethovenian, and the FAE scherzo is da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, which is, of course, the motto for the beginning of the Fifth Symphony. It's not quite the same here. It's da-da-da, da-da-da. You'll hear the similarity, but there's another explosion, and this nervous underpinning just never seems to disappear. Track 4, please. Rhythm plays such a powerful role in this scherzo.
Yeah, it's in the 6/8 meter, so your actual meter is the eighth notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So, and that's what gives us the power, because at times it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's what makes it somewhat Hungarian as well.
It does indeed. And it has a forward propulsion that derives from what musicians call compound rhythm, which is the different ways you can construe the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which could be 1 and 2 and 1 and 2, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
In fact, in the opening, when the cello gives you the rhythm, 1, 2, 1, 2, we are always coming in on the weak beat, dum, ba, da, da. You should listen for that.
Brahms's finale to the quintet, to the best of my knowledge, is the only piece of chamber music in which he provided a slow introduction to the finale. And this opening, it's almost as chromatic as the very famous slow introduction to Mozart's Dissonance String Quartet, K465. But of course, the harmonies are almost 100 years more advanced, and again, very Brahmsian harmonies. The example I have clipped here is from the allegro that it leads to. Once again, we hear a lot more balanced dialogue between the piano and the four string players, and there's a lot of give and take between the piano and the strings. Much better balance there. Track 5, please. So you hear intense drama, close dialogue, greater communication and unity among 5 very, really different instruments. But there's a lot of imitation and counterpoint going on in there too, and these are things that preoccupied Brahms for much of his career. The slide that was there with the handwriting of Joseph Gansbacher, he is almost certainly the reason that we got the first cello sonata. Brahms had been turned over for the second time as the conductor of the Hamburg Orchestra, and Gansbacher, who really admired Brahms, got him an appointment as the director of the Vienna Sing Academy. And Gansbacher was an eminent cellist. He was not a concert variety cellist, but he was accomplished enough so that we believe that Brahms wrote this piece with him in mind and may have actually given him an autographed copy. He was an important patron who was instrumental in getting Brahms established as a professional in Vienna after he came there from Hamburg. So the cello sonata, now here we're moving to the same one instrument versus piano, and it really is a sort of versus thing in that scherzo. But you're going to hear a much more mellifluous interaction in the first movement of this cello sonata. The main theme is all about the cello, first in its baritone register and then an octave up in its tenor register. Track 6, please. So you hear the piano is in a completely supportive role there, just a very gentle, syncopated underpinning with the chords. That does not mean that Brahms has forgotten how to write dramatic music for cello and piano together. He was at pains to put the focus on the cellist from the opening measures of that piece.
You know, we should mention that if you look at the violin, the G major violin sonata, very similar opening where it's just the pulse. And I wonder if it's a coincidence when his first foray into something like that, but for both instruments, was all about letting that string instrument sing, and then they become more chamber music duo.
And thank goodness he did, because he gave us 2 of the great masterpieces of duo sonatas in the entire literature, and the ones that followed weren't so bad either.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So my next example shows how that same movement moves into what I call Brahmsian angst. He's definitely ratcheting up the drama and showing that even the mellifluous cello, which sounded so warm and lyrical in that opening theme, can be quite dramatic midway through. Let's hear track 7, please. Now here again, the piano is in a supportive role with, if you can call it a melody. The foreground is very definitely favoring the cello, but the piano is very active in its supporting role. It's just doing it in a much more dramatic and visible, audible, if you will, way. So these two sonatas that we're hearing this afternoon, both of them are in 3 movements as opposed to the quintet being in 4. My next example is from the second movement, which almost sounds like a caprice. And I hear a distinct Hungarian accent in this movement, which I would trace back to his time, Brahms's time, touring with Reményi, and also Joachim had Hungarian roots.
The friendship with Joachim permeates the entire catalog, including his orchestral catalog, but I think it's part of the signature of Brahms.
So this second movement becomes sort of a quasi-Hungarian dance. Let's listen to track 8, please. The finale is one of the most, how shall I say it, notorious movements in the cello literature. You will read in the program notes, it has often been compared to one of the contrapuncti from Bach's Art of Fugue. And it is very definitely chromatic and fugal almost throughout. It's also beastly hard for both instruments.
Indeed, and I think it's really important to mention that in Brahms's time, you had to still prove your worth, if you will, as a composer. And the best way to do it is to write a fugue, because anybody can write a lousy fugue, and it's very hard to write a great fugue with a great subject like this one.
Yeah, and it is a great subject. This is from the development section. It's a sort of modified sonata form, masquerading as a fugue at the opening. You won't be able to miss those fugal entrances at the start. But my example is from the middle. It's very dense developmental writing that is going to resolve to very strict counterpoint, which is going to recall that opening fugue subject. Track 9, please. We are going to move now to what I still call the clarinet sonata, but this afternoon it's a viola sonata. Our old friend Joseph Joachim comes back in this one. And let's see if we can move
Next
forward.
slide, maybe?
Yeah. Brahms met a clarinetist named Richard Mühlfeld in, I think it was Meiningen maybe, pretty late in his career, and he just told his publisher, I'm done with composing, and then he said, wait a minute, I met this fabulous clarinetist, and he started writing all this great chamber music with clarinet. There is cello, a trio with cello, there's the wonderful clarinet and string quartet, quintet, and these 2 sonatas for clarinet and piano. Well, Joseph Joachim, who had started playing a lot of viola in addition to violin, went to Brahms and said, this is exactly in my viola range. How about making an arrangement for me of the 2 clarinet sonatas? And violists to this day claim them as their own. Right. And it sounds glorious in whichever version you're going to hear. The significance from the standpoint of this chronological survey is that these 2 sonatas of Opus 120 were absolutely the last chamber music that Brahms wrote. And I think he had 102 published opus numbers before he died in 1897. And the other thing is that the finale, which we're not going to hear in these examples, is also the last set of variations that he wrote. And Brahms wrote wonderful variations, as did Beethoven before him throughout his career.
We should mention that throughout their life, Brahms and Joachim had a wonderful relationship, but they did have a falling out. And then the double concerto with the cello and violin was kind of their rekindling of their friendship. So here, towards the end, I think Brahms was very happy to have made this into a viola sonata and really kind of grant everything he could for Joachim and his friendship with Joachim to be really solid at the end there.
Listening to this sonata again when I was preparing for this afternoon, I was very struck by the gentleness and serenity, particularly in this first movement. The traditional dichotomy in sonata form is that your exposition gives you two principal themes which tend to be very different in character. That is not the case here. They're very similar in character, although they follow the tonal progression that musicians would expect. I'd like to hear these back to back. First, you're going to hear the main theme, which is all about, which is very gentle and warm, and it really stresses the warm quality of the viola as an instrument. The second theme has the same character. There's a striking lack of contrast except in musical content. May we hear them back to back, please? These are numbers 10 and 11. Now, moving to the second theme. Apart from the difference in character, that is to say, the musical content, I think the biggest difference here is that the piano was almost like a Chopin nocturne in the way it was meandering through those arpeggios for the first theme. But the second one, it's slightly more rhythmic and it becomes chordal. So he's getting contrast here, but in much more subtle ways than earlier in his career.
Indeed, but I will say that if you listen to the second example when it's in order, there's a wonderful balance to the tessitura, to the range. So you have things on the E string, on the C string, which is the lowest string on the viola, and then you have things on the A string, which is the highest string on the viola. So you're really getting that lilt also in terms of range of where Brahms puts it.
As I said, this is another three-movement sonata, and this time Brahms doesn't go with a quasi-Hungarian dance in the middle. That second movement in the Opus 120 Sonata is all about blood and thunder. He's showing that either clarinet and piano or viola and piano can get just as much excitement drummed up as any other combination of instruments, including solo piano, for which Brahms writes. Let's hear number 12, please. That last passage, which is sort of an echo, but it's for piano solo after the theme has been introduced, it could have come out of one of the two piano concerti by
Absolutely.
Brahms.
And it's technically, fiendishly difficult because you have all those octaves which are supposed to be legato. So essentially you have two voices all at the same time.
I have already told you that the finale to the viola sonata is the last set of variations that Brahms wrote, and they are indeed delicious. And the end comes as a surprise, which I'm not going to give away. But at this point, we want to move on to Sarasate. I've just given you a full meal of Brahms, and Sarasate is the dessert with lots of whipped cream. Pablo de Sarasate, like Joseph Joachim, was one of the great violinists of the 19th century, but they could not have been more different in their repertoire, their approach to the instrument, their technique. Gary, can you elucidate?
For the next 2 hours, I could, but for the next 30 seconds, I'll tell you that Sarasate was a nationalist, much like Dvorak, and he was in love with the melodies of his native Spain. So just about everything he wrote was something that you would have heard on the streets in Spain, and Navarra is no exception. It's really a love song with two violins and piano about his native Spain.
But just taking a broader view of his contribution to the literature, he wrote for he wrote for himself, obviously, but a lot of the great composers who were active during the last decades of the 19th century were writing for Sarasate because he was sort of a Paganini-like figure, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And also he loved opera. Maybe one of the most famous pieces of Sarasate, the composer, is Carmen Fantasy.
Right.
Carmen Fantasy, and he has Rigoletto fantasies. Yeah. But that, I would also argue, any virtuoso, including Joachim, would have written some sort of an opera fantasy for practical reasons. People loved opera. Yeah. It sold very well.
But he also understood the commercial potential of what he was doing, and he was not above dabbling in other cultures beyond Spanish. For example, the Zigeunerweisen,
right,
which is another one of his most famous pieces.
Well, because gypsies would be all over Europe, although we think of them as Romanian and maybe partly Hungarian, but I mean, they would be all over Europe, including in Spain.
So this piece that we are going to hear is all about the fun that two virtuoso violinists can have together. And it's not about anything you can do, I can do better. It's about look how much fun we can have. Think of it as like synchronized swimming for two acrobats. I know I'm mixing my metaphors, but there are a lot of things in there in this piece that go aerial on you.
I completely agree, though. That's perfect.
Wow. Thank you. This from a non-string player. At any rate, my first example from Navarra, which is the region, if we could move ahead, I think I have a map of where Navarre is,
there it is.
In Spain. So he was passionately in love with the folk music of his native region, and that's what he was trying to celebrate in this piece. What I love about this little clip is that he moves from a Spanish dance, which is straight out of the Navarre region, and he goes right into schmaltz that sounds straight out of a Viennese coffee house. May we hear track 13, please? It's pretty hard not to smile when you're listening to this stuff. And you can see he was a bit of a dandy also. The picture on the right was of Pamplona, which is the famous city where the running of the bulls happens every year. That is the regional capital of Navarre, and that's why I put that one in there. My last example is, I'm going to ask Gary to explain what's going on with the fiddles, but it's fireworks. This piece is all about violinistic fireworks at the same time that it's just seducing the ear, because who can resist music like this? So we're going to have harmonics and then a couple of other techniques that Gary's going to explain to us. And I need to let you know that I've intentionally cut off the example because it's towards the end, so that you'll be left in suspense as to what happens as Sarasate completes Navarro. Track 14, please. I told you I was going to leave you hanging. Okay, Gary, tell us what the two violins are doing.
There's really two main techniques here. The harmonics that Laurie just mentioned. This is strictly speaking an artificial harmonic. So a regular harmonic is the finger on top of the string without pushing it down, which shortens the string to a certain really geometric proportion. But the artificial harmonic is actually a fourth down, and so you hold one finger down, and then the fourth finger usually, although you can extend, a fourth above that. And so the effect is much like a flute. And then the second effect, which is even more exciting, especially when you get to play it, is what's called a left-hand pizzicato. So all of you know regular pizzicato, which is done with the bow arm, and it's a plucking. In this case, it's supposed to imitate the guitar. But left-hand pizzicato actually does a plucking with one of the fingers of the left hand when the lower fingers holds the notes. So in some ways, you're getting a lot more noise out of it, but it's also very virtuosic technique, and it's even more virtuosic when two people do it.
And the two people who will be playing it this afternoon with Alessandro Del Giovan at the piano are Gary Levinson and Dylan Naroff. And you might explain why you chose this particular piece on an otherwise all Brahms program.
Well, for one thing, it's really fun to play with Dylan. And there's not that many great two violin and piano pieces. And the other thing is that to do an all Brahms program, which is done fairly often, and these are all masterpieces, can be a little heavy on the ear. So for me, this was sort of a foil, not just selfishly to get to play with Dylan and Alessandro, but also to let the ears of the audience rest a little bit with something that will continuously put a smile on your face.
And am I correct that we also have another debut participant in this afternoon's program?
We do. Julian Schwartz, a wonderful cellist, someone that I met very recently. I think you will love his Brahms Cello Sonata and his chamber music playing. Is making his debut here, so we'll welcome him with open arms in about 15 minutes.
All in all, it's a very special afternoon of music, and I am so delighted that you are all here to enjoy it with us. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. All right, well done.